In every generation, monsters are born, but not the kind with horns or claws. No, these monsters wear human faces. They smile, they speak, they blend in, and yet inside them is a hunger, a dark, bottomless hunger. Tonight we walk into the minds of the most brutal serial killers the world has ever known. These aren't just stories of death, they are stories of obsession, of rage, of complete disconnection from humanity. Some did it for pleasure, some for revenge, and others simply because they could. We won't tell these stories to glorify evil, we tell them to confront it, to remember the victims, to understand how it hides in plain sight. Because the devil doesn't wear red, he wears a suit or a uniform or a father's smile. Andrei Chikatilo, the butcher of Rostov. The Soviet Union didn't believe in serial killers, but Andrei Chikatilo made sure they couldn't ignore the truth. Born in 1936 in Ukraine during Stalin's Great Famine, Chikatilo's early life was soaked in trauma. His family was starving. He was told his brother had been kidnapped and eaten. His father was labeled a coward during the war and publicly shamed. His mother was distant, cold, and reportedly abusive. As a boy, Andrei was weak, painfully shy, and socially isolated. He suffered from chronic bedwetting and, more crucially, impotence, something that haunted him and would later define his violence. He was bullied mercilessly, especially in adolescence. In his 20s and 30s, he tried to function like a normal man. He got married, had children. He worked as a teacher, but inside, he was unraveling. He began molesting students, eventually fired, but not prosecuted. He slid through the cracks of a system more concerned with reputation than justice. In 1978, he committed his first known murder, a 9-year-old girl. He lured her into a cabin, attacked her, stabbed her to death, and found, for the first time, that murder aroused him. It awakened something inside him that had been buried for decades. Over the next 12 years, he killed again and again, often children and teens, both boys and girls. He mutilated them, cutting out eyes, ears, genitals. He stabbed some victims over 30 times. He removed internal organs. He even bit off tongues and nipples. Some victims had pieces of their flesh chewed or removed, possibly eaten. He would leave their bodies in forests, rivers, train yards. The pattern was clear to investigators, but not to the Soviet regime, which still insisted such crimes didn't exist in a communist society. In 1984, he was arrested on suspicion, but DNA tests at the time couldn't conclusively match him, and he was released. He would go on to kill at least 20 more times before he was finally caught in 1990. The arrest was pure chance. An undercover officer noticed him approaching young people at a station. Upon surveillance and questioning, police found incriminating items in his briefcase: rope. Caged in a steel cell, he screamed at the judge, stripped naked, licked the bars. He tried to appear insane, but it didn't matter. The court found him guilty of 52 murders. He was sentenced to death and executed in 1994, a single bullet behind the ear. No ceremony, no closure. His legacy is one of pure carnage. A killer born from trauma, hiding in plain sight, enabled by a system that chose silence over action. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. He slipped through the cracks of Los Angeles. A shadow in the dark, a phantom in the heat of summer. He didn't have a type. He didn't have a pattern. He killed whoever he wanted. His name was Richard Ramirez. To the world, he became the Night Stalker. Born in 1960 in El Paso, Texas, Ramirez was the youngest of 5. His father was abusive. Violent outbursts were routine. But worse than that, Richard's cousin Mike, a Vietnam War veteran, introduced him to real-life horror. Mike showed him Polaroids of women he had raped and decapitated during the war. He taught Richard about stealth, stalking, domination, and at just 13 years old, Richard watched Mike shoot his wife in the face, right in front of him. The trauma fused with fantasy. By 15, he was experimenting with Satanism, breaking into homes, and using heavy drugs like cocaine and LSD. By 24, he began to kill. Between 1984 and 1985, Ramirez committed at least 13 murders, possibly more. He raped, stabbed, shot, and bludgeoned his victims. He attacked men and women, children, and seniors. Sometimes he left messages in lipstick, pentagrams, "Hail Satan." In one case, he broke into a home, shot the husband, and then told the wife, "Swear on Satan that you love him." He forced victims to pray to the devil. He wore black clothes and baseball caps. He stole jewelry and dumped it off for drug money. Police were baffled. His crimes were random. He used different weapons, left no consistent pattern. It was chaos by design. But a break came when one victim survived. Her description, combined with fingerprints from a stolen car, led to a mugshot being released to the public. On August 31, 1985, a group of civilians spotted him in East LA. They chased him down and beat him with a pipe until police arrived. At trial, Ramirez showed no remorse. He smiled, flashed a pentagram carved into his hand, and said, "Hail Satan." He was convicted of 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, and 14 burglaries. Sentenced to death, Ramirez spent over 2 decades on death row. He died in 2013 of complications from lymphoma. His last words? Unknown, but his eyes were empty, even at the end. Hakim Kroll, the cannibal of the Ruhr. Germany, 1960s. A quiet man lived alone in a small, grimy apartment in the industrial town, raped and strangled near a lake. No one suspected him. So he kept going. For over 20 years. He didn't kill quickly. He stalked his victims, often young girls or women walking alone. Once he had them, he'd strangle them, molest the corpses, then cut off pieces to eat later. Why? He said human flesh was cheaper than pork. Kroll would boil body parts, store them in his fridge, and cook them into stews. When asked why he started eating people, he replied, "Food was expensive, and I got used to it." In total, Kroll admitted to murdering at least 14 people. The youngest? Just 4 years old. He was caught in 1976, not by police, but by a plumber. Neighbors had complained about a clogged drain. When maintenance opened it, they found human remains. A child's hand and part of a lung. Inside Kroll's apartment, police found a pot on the stove. Inside was a stew, with human flesh floating in it. Kroll calmly confessed, sitting on his bed as police vomited around him. He was sentenced to life in prison and died in 1991. Unlike others, he didn't seem proud or evil. He seemed indifferent. That made him all the more terrifying. America's first female serial killer. Most serial killers are men, but Eileen Wuornos was different. She was called America's first female serial killer, though her story is far more complicated than the headlines. Born in 1956 in Michigan, Eileen never stood a chance. Her father was a convicted child molester who hanged himself in prison. Her mother abandoned her at age 4. She was raised by alcoholic grandparents who beat and sexually abused her. By age 11, she was prostituting herself for food and cigarettes. At 14, she was pregnant, raped by a family friend. Her baby was taken away. She was kicked out of the house and lived in the woods. She drifted from town to town, arrested for theft, assault, prostitution, until 1989, when the murders began. To the outside world, he was just an old man. Frail, polite, quiet, but behind that wrinkled face was a monster far more twisted than any fiction. Albert Fish, born in 1870, was one of the most depraved serial killers in American history. He grew up in a family riddled with mental illness, hallucinations, mania, suicides. As a child, he was beaten in an orphanage, where he began to enjoy pain. By adulthood, Fish had developed disturbing fetishes. He whipped himself bloody, inserted needles into his body, over 20 found in his pelvis via X-ray, drank urine and consumed feces, and most disturbingly, he began preying on children. Fish would lure boys and girls, typically between 4 and 11 years old, with candy or job offers. He would rape, torture and kill them, and sometimes cook and eat parts of their bodies. His most notorious victim was Grace Budd, 10 years old. He convinced her parents to let her accompany him to a fake birthday party. She never returned. 6 years later, Fish sent a detailed letter to her mother, describing how he strangled Grace and cooked her flesh in a stew. He was arrested in 1934. He confessed calmly. No remorse, no emotion. In court, experts described him as sadistic, cannibalistic, and psychotic. Yet he was declared sane and sentenced to die. On January 16, 1936, Albert Fish was executed in the electric chair. Due to the metal needles inside him, it's rumored the chair malfunctioned. His final words? "I don't even know why I'm here." Pedro Lopez, the monster of the Andes. Pedro Lopez, the monster of the Andes. Pedro Lopez is considered by many to be the most prolific child killer in modern history. He confessed to murdering over 300 girls across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. Born in 1948 in Colombia, Lopez was abandoned at a young age and lived on the streets. At age 8, he was kidnapped and raped by a stranger. Instead of breaking him, it seemed to awaken something darker. By his teens, he began assaulting and murdering young girls. He traveled from town to town, targeting rural communities. His victims were always the same, girls aged 8 to 12. He would lure them away from markets, rape, strangle, and bury them in mass graves. Sometimes he killed 3 in one day. He was caught in 1980 after attempting to abduct another girl. He confessed to everything, even led police to dozens of graves. In Ecuador, he was convicted of 110 murders, but served only 14 years due to the country's maximum sentence laws. After his release, he was arrested in Colombia, then sent to a psychiatric hospital, and eventually released again. Pedro Lopez disappeared in 1998. His current location? Unknown. Javed Kubal, the 100-child killer. Javed Iqbal, a wealthy man in Lahore, Pakistan, shocked the world when he sent a letter to a local newspaper in 1999. "I have killed 100 children, all boys between 6 and 16. Their bodies have been dissolved in acid." Police raided his home. Inside, they found vats of acid, clothing, and photographs of the victims. He had documented every name, every age, and kept personal items from each child. Iqbal targeted runaway boys, those living on the streets. He promised them work, food, or shelter. Instead, he raped, strangled, and dissolved them in acid to eliminate evidence. Why did he do it? He claimed it was revenge on the police. Years earlier, he had been falsely accused of abuse and was allegedly tortured. He said his crimes were a message to expose how easily children on the streets could vanish, and no one would care. He turned himself in. A judge sentenced him to death and ruled that his punishment would mirror his crimes. He shall be strangled with the same chain, then his body dissolved in acid in front of the parents. But that never happened. Just days before his sentence was to be carried out, Javed Iqbal was found dead in his cell, hanged. Some say it was suicide. Others believe the families of his victims, or guards, took justice into their own hands. What we learn from darkness. What makes a serial killer? Is it nature or nurture, evil or trauma, born monsters or made by the world? The killers we've explored tonight, Chikatilo, Ramirez, Fish, Lopez, Iqbal, Kroll, Warnos, came from different countries, different upbringings, different motivations, but they share one thing in common: a complete disconnection from empathy, the ability to look another human in the eyes and see nothing. These stories are not told to glorify evil. They're not entertainment. They are warnings, reminders that the monsters we fear most don't hide under our beds. They walk among us, shop in our grocery stores, smile in our offices. Sometimes they even wear uniforms or call themselves family. The truth is, evil doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers, it waits, it watches, and when the world turns its back, it strikes. What we owe to the victims, every child lost, every family broken, is to remember, to pay attention, to never ignore the signs, because once evil is ignored, it grows teeth.
He began working as a school teacher, hoping to earn respect and provide for his family. But he had a hard time connecting with his students. He was often mocked in class and struggled to keep control. Other teachers noticed he was awkward and kept to himself. Eventually, he left teaching and took a job as a clerk in a factory. From the outside, he seemed to settle into a simple, quiet routine, but inside, he was falling apart. In 1978, Chikatilo made a choice that would change everything. He lured a young girl into an abandoned building under the pretense of helping her find her way home. When it was over, he panicked. He tried to cover his tracks, hid her belongings, and left quietly. When her body was found, police quickly arrested someone else, a man who eventually confessed under pressure and was convicted. This mistake would allow Andre to continue his secret acts for years. Throughout the 1980s, Chikatilo became bolder. He began traveling from city to city, using the Soviet railway system to find his victims. He targeted bus and train stations, crowded, chaotic places where people often went missing without notice. He would approach young people, often children or teenagers, and offer to help them find food or work. His calm, quiet manner made him seem trustworthy, but once he got them into an isolated area, he revealed his true intentions. Then, he would simply walk away, clean himself up, and return to his daily life. It happened again and again. Dozens of young people vanished from the streets of Rostov and other cities. At first, Soviet authorities refused to admit a serial killer could exist. The government didn't want to acknowledge that such a thing could happen in a perfect socialist society. Instead, they blamed the victims, calling them runaways or criminals. They arrested innocent men. At least one was wrongly executed. Meanwhile, Chikatilo kept going. He became more confident. He even watched police at crime scenes, blending in with the crowd. Years passed. Families of the victims begged for answers. Police worked tirelessly, but they kept looking in the wrong places. Finally, in the early 1990s, investigators began to connect the dots. They noticed the same man seen at train stations and bus stops just before young people went missing. Witnesses described a tall, thin man with glasses, carrying a briefcase. In 1990, police put him under surveillance. They watched him at a market, approaching young boys and girls. They noticed his strange behavior, pacing, watching people too closely, circling the platforms. When they stopped him, they found suspicious items in his bag: a rope, a knife, and a bottle of alcohol. He was arrested and brought in for questioning. At first, Chikatilo denied everything, but after days of questioning, he broke down. He confessed in chilling detail to over 50 attacks. He even took police to hidden places where he had left his victims. He spoke calmly, showing little emotion, as he explained what he had done.
When asked why, he said simply, "I couldn't stop myself. I don't know why. I just couldn't stop."
Chikatilo's trial in 1992 became a media sensation in Russia. In the courtroom, he was kept inside a metal cage to protect him from angry relatives of his victims. People shouted at him. Some even tried to attack him. He was found guilty of 52 counts and sentenced to death. In February 1994, the sentence was carried out. The story of Andrei Chikatilo is a haunting reminder that evil can hide in plain sight. He lived a quiet life. He worked a regular job. He raised a family. He walked the same streets as everyone else. And yet, for years, he led a secret life of unspeakable harm. It also reminds us how dangerous it can be to ignore warning signs, and how important it is to listen to the victims' families, even when the truth is hard to believe. John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown. In the suburbs of Chicago in the 1970s, there lived a man who seemed like the perfect neighbor. His name was John Wayne Gacy. He threw barbecues for his friends. He worked hard running a small construction company. He volunteered with the local Democratic Party. He even dressed up as a clown named Pogo to entertain children at charity events and hospitals. Everyone who knew him said the same thing. He was friendly, helpful, cheerful, the kind of person you could count on if you needed something. But behind the smiling face of John Wayne Gacy was one of the most shocking double lives in modern American history. John Wayne Gacy was born in 1942 in Chicago. He was the second of 3 children. His father was a hard man, strict, sometimes cruel, and John grew up desperate to please him. But no matter what he did, his father seemed to see him as weak. As a boy, John was overweight, shy, and sometimes sick. He never quite fit in with the other kids. When he got older, he tried harder to win people's approval. He joined clubs, volunteered, and worked long hours. But even as he built a normal-looking life, there was a darkness growing inside him. By the 1970s, Gacy had built a good life on the outside. He owned a successful construction company and hired young men in his neighborhood to work for him. He joined local political groups and even met the First Lady of the United States during a campaign event. And then there was the clown act. Gacy enjoyed putting on makeup and a costume and becoming Pogo the Clown. He said it was just for fun, a way to make kids laugh at hospitals and parties, but the clown makeup hid more than just his face. In the quiet suburb where Gacy lived, young men started disappearing. Most of them were teenagers or in their early 20s. Many of them worked for Gacy at his construction company. Others were boys he picked up at bus stops or offered jobs to. One by one, they vanished. For years, no one knew why. Police sometimes questioned Gacy, but he always stayed calm. He was polite and helpful, even offering to help them search. He made jokes. He charmed them. Meanwhile, his house at 8213 Summerdale Avenue was hiding a secret. In December 1978, a 15-year-old boy named Robert Pice disappeared after telling his mother he was going to talk to a man about a job. That man was John Wayne Gacy. This time, police paid closer attention. They noticed inconsistencies in Gacy's story. They began watching him. As they gathered evidence, they discovered a pattern. Dozens of young men who had disappeared after meeting with Gacy. Finally, police searched his house. What they found shocked even the most experienced officers. In the crawl space under his house, they discovered the remains of multiple young men. The smiling neighbor who hosted parties, entertained children, and dressed as a clown had been hiding the truth in his own home. John Wayne Gacy was arrested and charged. At his trial, he claimed he had another personality, a darker side he called Jack, who was responsible for everything. But the evidence was overwhelming. He was convicted of taking the lives of 33 young men and boys, though some believed the true number may be higher. In court, he showed little emotion. He joked with reporters and even painted portraits of himself as a clown from his jail cell. He was sentenced to death. For years, Gacy sat on death row, painting and giving interviews, where he denied responsibility. He insisted he was innocent and claimed the police were framing him. But on May 10th, 1994, he was executed. His final words reportedly were, "Kiss my eye." Even at the end, he refused to show remorse. The story of John Wayne Gacy is a chilling reminder that appearances can be deceiving. He was a clown who made children laugh. He was a businessman who shook hands with politicians. He was a neighbor who hosted barbecues. And yet, behind closed doors, he led a life of hidden harm and cruelty. He reminds us to look deeper, to trust our instincts, and to remember that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who seem the friendliest. Pedro Lopez, the monster of the Andes. High in the mountains of South America, among the winding roads and small villages of Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, children began to vanish. They were poor children, often living on the streets or selling small things in markets to help their families. One by one, they disappeared quietly, without much notice from the authorities. At first, no one realized these disappearances were connected. Life in the Andes was hard, and many children left home to look for work or simply got lost in the big cities. But behind these disappearances was one man. His name was Pedro Lopez, and he would later be called the Monster of the Andes. Pedro Lopez was born in 1948 in a poor town in Colombia. He was one of 13 children. His father died before he was born, leaving his mother to raise the family alone. Pedro's childhood was full of hardship. His mother was strict and often angry, and Pedro felt unwanted and unloved. He ran away from home when he was still very young. He lived on the streets, the capital city. There he slept in doorways, begged for food, and learned how cruel the world could be. As he grew older, Pedro began to travel. He wandered from town to town, crossing borders into Ecuador and Peru. He lived by stealing, picking up odd jobs, and blending in with the poor. But during these years, something inside him became darker. He began to target young girls, children living on the streets, selling candy or shining shoes to survive. They were easy targets. No one was watching over them, and no one noticed when they disappeared. Pedro developed a method. He would visit busy markets, pretending to shop or watch the crowd. He was quiet and polite, and no one suspected him of anything. He would approach young girls, speak softly to them, and offer them food or small gifts. Then he would take them just outside of town, to a field, a forest, or a hidden spot where no one could see. When it was over, he would leave them there and return to town as if nothing had happened, and then he would do it again. For years, Pedro Lopez moved unnoticed through villages and cities. In Ecuador alone, it's believed he harmed more than 100 girls. It wasn't until heavy rains flooded a river near the town of Ambato, Ecuador, that his secret began to come out. The floods washed away soil and revealed the remains of several children. The townspeople were horrified. Parents who had long wondered what happened to their daughters demanded answers. Police began investigating more seriously. At first, they thought it was the work of a group of criminals. They never imagined it was just one man. Pedro's undoing came in 1980, when he was caught in a failed attempt. He tried to lure a young girl from a marketplace, but she screamed and ran. Nearby merchants caught him and held him until police arrived. At first, Pedro denied everything. But after hours of questioning, he confessed. He calmly told police he had taken the lives of over 100 girls in Ecuador, and even more in Colombia and Peru. He even offered to show police where he left his victims. Over several days, he led investigators to graves scattered across the countryside, some barely hidden, others buried deep in the ground. Pedro Lopez was tried and convicted in Ecuador for more than 100 counts. But because of the country's laws at the time, the maximum sentence was just 16 years. Even after committing so many terrible acts, that was all the law allowed. He was released from prison in 1994 after serving just 14 years. Incredibly, he was arrested again in Colombia after his release, but was later declared insane and sent to a psychiatric hospital. In 1998, he was released and simply disappeared. To this day, no one knows where he is. Some believe he returned to his old ways. Others believe he fled into hiding. Pedro Lopez's story is one of the most chilling examples of how vulnerable children can be when society doesn't protect them. His crimes went unnoticed for years because his victims were poor, homeless, or living on the margins. It shows how important it is for communities to look out for their most vulnerable members, and how dangerous it can be to ignore the warning signs. And perhaps most haunting of all, he may still be alive somewhere out there in the early 1980s, near Seattle, Washington. A quiet river flowed through the forests and farmlands. It was called the Green River. To most people, it was just another peaceful place in the Pacific Northwest, a place for fishing, picnics, or walking by the water. But one day, a fisherman noticed something strange floating in the water. Then another, and another. By the time police finished their first search, they had found several young women, all in the same area of the riverbank. It was the beginning of one of the longest and most chilling investigations in American history. And at the center of it all was a man no one suspected, a man named Gary Ridgway. Gary Ridgway was born in 1949 in Salt Lake City, Utah. His family moved to Washington State when he was young. He grew up in a simple home with his parents and two brothers. Even as a child, Gary was quiet. He didn't stand out much at school. His teachers described him as shy, but polite. His classmates thought he was odd, but harmless. But there were early signs that something was wrong. He sometimes became angry for no reason. He didn't seem to feel things the way other kids did. When he was a teenager, he stabbed a young boy in the woods, just to see what it would feel like. As a boy survived, but Gary was never arrested. As an adult, Gary worked at a truck factory south of Seattle. He held the same job for decades, painting trucks on an assembly line. He was known as a hard worker, quiet, always on time. He married young and had a son. He bought a small house and mowed his lawn every weekend. To his neighbors, he seemed like a normal, working-class man. But at night, Gary lived another life. He would drive through the streets, looking for young women walking alone. Many of his victims were vulnerable, living on the streets or struggling to survive. He would offer them a ride, promise them food or money, and then drive to a secluded area near the river. When he was done, he would leave them there and go home, often hugging his son and eating dinner with his family, as if nothing had happened. As the number of young women found along the river grew, police realized they were dealing with the same person. They formed the Green River Task Force, a special team of detectives dedicated to catching him. They interviewed hundreds of people. They followed countless tips. They even questioned Gary Ridgway several times. But each time, he calmly answered their questions and passed a lie detector test. Meanwhile, the attacks continued. For nearly 2 decades, Gary Ridgway eluded capture. He became one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, and no one knew. Then, in 2001, new DNA technology finally gave investigators the evidence they needed. They tested samples from the original crime scenes and matched them to Gary Ridgway. After more than 20 years, the quiet factory worker was arrested. At first, Gary denied everything. But when faced with the DNA evidence, he confessed. He told investigators he couldn't even remember all the names of the women he hurt. He admitted to more than 40 deaths, and later said the number was closer to 70. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, he agreed to help police find the remains of many of his victims. He led them to fields, forests, and riverbanks where he had left them years earlier. In court, he stood quietly as the families of his victims spoke. Many of them cried, some yelled at him, others just stared. Gary Ridgway showed almost no emotion. Gary Ridgway was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He remains behind bars to this day, spending his time in a small cell, far from the river where his crimes began. Gary Ridgway's story is a chilling reminder that people are not always what they seem. He went to work every day, he paid his bills, he played with his son, and yet for years he led a secret life of cruelty and deception. It also reminds us how important it is to keep searching for answers, even when the trail goes cold. Thanks to the determination of investigators and advances in science, the truth eventually came out. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, police in Florida began to notice a troubling pattern. Middle-aged men were being found dead along highways, their cars abandoned, their belongings missing. At first, investigators thought these were random robberies or unrelated crimes, but as the number grew, they realized it was the work of one person. When they finally made an arrest, many were shocked to see who it was. Not a man, but a woman. Her name was Aileen Wuornos, and she would soon be called America's most notorious female serial killer. Aileen Wuornos was born in 1956 in Michigan. Her childhood was filled with pain and loss. Her father was never around, and her mother abandoned her when she was very young. She and her brother were raised by their grandparents, but even then, her life was unstable. She often felt unwanted and unloved. As a teenager, she ran away from home. She began living on the streets, sleeping in abandoned cars and surviving however she could. She dreamed of a better life, a home, a family, a fresh start. But she never seemed to find it. By her 20s, Aileen had become a drifter. She hitchhiked across the country, staying wherever she could, picking up odd jobs, and often resorting to sex work to survive. She spent time in and out of jail for theft, fighting, and other small crimes. She lived on the edge of society, often homeless, always searching for something better. In the late 1980s, she settled in Florida. She met a woman named Tyria Moore, and the two began a relationship. For a while, Aileen thought she had finally found love, but they still struggled to make ends meet. And Aileen continued working along the highways, looking for clients. Between late 1989 and late 1990, 7 men were found dead along Florida highways. Each had been shot, their cars taken, and their body left in rural areas. Police were confused at first, but then they began to notice similarities. The victims were all men who had been traveling alone. Each had picked up a hitchhiker before disappearing. Eventually, they found one victim's abandoned car, and inside were fingerprints. Those prints led them to Aileen Wuornos. In January 1991, police arrested Aileen at a bar in Port Orange, Florida. At first, she denied everything. She claimed she had been defending herself from men who tried to hurt her. She said she never intended to kill anyone, that she was just trying to protect herself. But as the evidence mounted, her story became harder to believe. Her partner, Tyria Moore, agreed to cooperate with police. She called Aileen and convinced her to confess during a recorded phone call. Aileen Wuornos's trial drew massive media attention. People were fascinated by the idea of a woman, especially one who had lived such a hard life, being a serial killer. In court, she was emotional, sometimes angry, sometimes crying. She claimed again and again that she had acted in self-defense, but the jury didn't believe her. She was convicted of multiple counts and sentenced to death. Over the years, she gave interviews from prison, sometimes sticking to her self-defense story, other times admitting she had done wrong. Her mental state seemed to worsen as time went on. On October 9th, 2002, Eileen Wuornos was executed. She was 46 years old. Her final words were strange and rambling, a mix of anger and defiance, as if she still felt misunderstood by the world. Eileen Wuornos' story is complicated. She was both a victim of circumstance and someone who chose to hurt others. Her life shows how pain and hardship can shape someone in ways we don't always understand. She reminds us to look at the bigger picture, to see not just what someone does, but what brought them to that point. And she reminds us that even in the darkest stories, there are lessons about how society treats its most vulnerable people. In the summer of 1985, Los Angeles was gripped by fear. The city, known for sunshine and palm trees, became a place of locked doors and dark streets. People who normally slept with windows open in the warm California nights began barricading their homes. Hardware stores sold out of locks, alarms, and flashlights because someone was creeping through the city at night, breaking into homes, hurting people in their sleep, leaving behind scenes of terror, and vanishing before anyone could stop him. The newspapers called him the Night Stalker. Richard Ramirez was born in 1960 in El Paso, Texas. He grew up in a crowded home with 4 older siblings and parents who worked long hours. As a boy, Richard was quiet but troubled. He suffered several head injuries, including being hit by a swing and knocked unconscious. Later, he began having seizures and nightmares. He spent a lot of time with his older cousin Mike, a Vietnam veteran, who showed him disturbing photographs and told him dark stories from the war. By his teenage years, Richard was already stealing, using drugs, and sleeping in cemeteries when he didn't want to go home. In his late teens, Richard moved to Los Angeles. There he lived a transient life, staying in cheap motels, spending time in bad neighborhoods, and using harder drugs. He began breaking into homes, stealing valuables to support his habits. But soon, burglary wasn't enough for him. He started to develop darker impulses, and he acted on them. In March 1985, the quiet streets of suburban Los Angeles became his hunting ground. He would watch a neighborhood during the day, then come back at night, slipping in through unlocked windows or doors. Sometimes he used a crowbar or a tire iron. Sometimes he simply walked in. His victims were random, young and old, men and women, families and individuals. He didn't seem to care who they were. He left behind strange symbols and whispered terrifying words to his victims. News of his attacks spread quickly. People began calling police with tips, but he was always gone before they arrived. Every night the city held its breath, wondering where he would strike next. As the attacks continued, police started to put the pieces together. They found footprints and fingerprints at several scenes. Witnesses described a tall, thin man with dark hair and rotting teeth. When he stole a car and left it behind, investigators finally got a clear fingerprint and matched it to Richard Ramirez. They released his name and photo to the public. On August 31st, 1985, Ramirez was spotted in East Los Angeles. He tried to carjack a woman, but neighbors recognized him from the news. A crowd formed and began chasing him. People shouted and hit him, knocking him to the ground. By the time police arrived, Richard Ramirez was bloody, bruised, and in handcuffs. The city of Los Angeles finally breathed a sigh of relief. Ramirez's trial was long and chaotic. He often smiled and laughed in court, showing no remorse.
He drew strange symbols on his palm and told reporters he worshipped darkness. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Fingerprints, witnesses, and his own words. He was convicted of 13 counts of taking lives, along with many counts of assault and burglary. He was sentenced to death. Even on death row, he received fan mail from admirers who were drawn to his rebellious image. He died in prison in 2013, before his sentence could be carried out. The story of Richard Ramirez shows how one person can spread fear through an entire city. It reminds us how important it is to take precautions, to lock doors, to watch over our neighbors, to stay vigilant. And it also shows how a community, when united, can stand up to fear and help bring someone to justice. In the 1990s, Europe watched a strange story unfold, a story about a man who fooled everyone around him. Jack Unterweger was a man of words. He was a writer, a poet, a journalist. He appeared on television and spoke at literary events. He was charming, intelligent, and seemed to be proof that even the worst person could change. But behind his smile and his carefully chosen words was a man who never really let go of his darkest instincts. Jack Unterweger was born in Austria in 1950. His mother was a barmaid, and his father, whom he never knew, was an American soldier. Jack grew up in poverty, raised by his grandfather, who was known to be abusive. He started stealing as a teenager, and soon his crimes became more serious. In his 20s, he was arrested and sentenced to life in prison for taking a young woman's life. While in prison, Jack discovered books. He began reading and writing poetry. He wrote plays, short stories, and an autobiography. His book became popular, and many people in Austria began to see him as a symbol of rehabilitation, a man who had changed. Writers, artists, and even politicians campaigned for his release. They believed that his time in prison had turned him into a better person. In 1990, after serving about 15 years, Jack was released. After leaving prison, Jack became something of a celebrity. He gave interviews about prison life. He attended parties with important people. He even became a crime reporter for a magazine. Ironically, his job as a journalist often sent him to report on violent crimes against women. He wrote about how sad he felt when he saw victims and how important it was to catch the people who hurt them. But all the while, Jack was hiding a terrible secret. He was the one committing those very same crimes. Not long after his release, young women in Austria began disappearing. They were often found in remote areas, and the method was eerily similar to the one Jack had used years earlier. At first, no one suspected him. After all, he was a reformed man, a respected writer and journalist. But then, police began noticing a pattern. Jack had been in the same cities where victims were found. In fact, he had been reporting on some of the very cases he himself was responsible for. By 1991, Jack was under investigation. But before police could arrest him, he fled Austria. He traveled to Switzerland, then France, and finally to the United States. Along the way, more women disappeared. The media called him the Playboy Killer because of his charm and good looks, and because he always seemed to have a woman on his arm. Finally, in Miami, Florida, he was caught. Jack was brought back to Austria to stand trial. In court, the evidence was overwhelming. DNA, witnesses, and his own travel records tied him to at least 11 deaths. The man who had once been seen as proof that people could change was revealed as someone who had only used his second chance to continue hurting others. He was sentenced to life in prison again. Jack Unterweger didn't stay in prison long this time. On the night of his
his sentencing in 1994, he took his own life in his cell. Jack Unterweger's story is one of deception, not just of others, but of himself. He shows us how easily people can be fooled by appearances, charm, and eloquent words. He also shows how dangerous it can be to ignore warning signs just because we want to believe someone has changed. It's a reminder
To look deeper and to remember that real change comes from actions, not just words. In the small city of Wichita, Kansas, people felt safe. It was the kind of place where neighbors waved at each other, kids rode bikes. And one of the most trusted neighbors was a man named Dennis Rader. He was a devoted husband and father. He worked for a home security company. He was a Boy Scout leader and the president of his church council. He seemed like the perfect citizen, but in secret, he was hiding one of the darkest double lives of all. Dennis Rader was born in 1945 in Kansas. He was the oldest of 4 brothers and grew up in a simple home. His parents worked long hours, and he sometimes felt ignored. From a young age, Dennis had troubling thoughts he didn't share with anyone. He learned to hide his true feelings behind a polite smile. On the outside, he was just another quiet, hard-working kid from the Midwest. But on the inside, something darker was growing. As an adult, Dennis married his wife, Paula. They had 2 children and bought a modest house. He served in the US Air Force and later took a job installing home security systems. A cruel irony, given his secret life. He became active in his church and community. Everyone who met him said he was friendly, even a little boring. But in 1974, his secret life began. That year, police in Wichita investigated a disturbing scene at a home where 4 family members had been attacked. At first, no one knew who was responsible. But soon a letter arrived at a local newspaper. It was written by the person who had done it. He called himself BTK, which stood for 3 words describing how he carried out his attacks. In the letter, he bragged about what he had done and taunted police, saying they would never catch him. Over the next several years, BTK struck again and again. Each time, he chose victims seemingly at random, often women living alone or families he had been watching. After each crime, he would disappear back into his normal life. He would mow his lawn, lead Boy Scout meetings, attend church services, all while pretending to be just another neighbor. He even sent more letters to newspapers, enjoying the fear he created and the attention he got from police. After the late 1970s, the letters stopped. For more than 2 decades, Wichita was quiet. Many believed BTK had moved away, been arrested for something else, or even died. But Dennis Rader was still there, living his normal life, raising his children, and waiting. In 2004, on the 30th anniversary of his first known crime, BTK resurfaced. He began sending letters to newspapers again, teasing police and claiming credit for his earlier crimes. What Dennis didn't realize was that technology had improved since the 1970s, and this time police were ready. One of his letters was sent on a computer disk. Police traced it to his church, and then to him. In 2005, they arrested Dennis Rader at his home. At first, Dennis denied everything, but once confronted with the evidence, he admitted it all. In chilling detail, he described how he chose his victims, how he planned his crimes, and how he lived with himself afterward. He said he couldn't stop himself, that it was part of who he was. In court, he showed no emotion as he listened to family members of his victims speak. He was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms, 1 for each life he took. Today, Dennis Rader is in prison in Kansas, where he spends his time writing letters and reading the Bible. He remains one of the most infamous examples of someone who lived a double life, for it reminds us that danger can come from the least likely places. He was trusted by his family, friends, church, and community. Yet he was hiding a life of unimaginable harm. His story shows how important it is to pay attention to the people around us, and how someone can fool even those closest to them. And it shows that even when justice is delayed,
It can still be done, thanks to persistence and progress. Over the last 2.5 hours, we've explored the lives and crimes of 10 of the most infamous serial killers in history. Each of them was different, some quiet, some charming, some violent, some calculating, but they all had one thing in common. They hid who they really were behind masks of normality. Their stories teach us about the darkest parts of human nature and the importance of protecting those who are vulnerable, staying vigilant, and never giving up on seeking justice. As haunting as these stories are, they are also lessons. Lessons about strength, community, and the determination to bring even the most hidden wrongs to light. Thank you for watching this documentary. Stay safe, stay aware, and always look out for each other.